led to her critique of macroeconomic models as being fundamentally flawed because they failed to incorporate women's unpaid labor, and in so doing, failed to address the inequalities that made growth socially inefficient and unsustainable. When in the 1990s she started to engage with the nuts and bolts of government budgets and the budgetary process, she showed that budgets needed to be engendered if the inherent gender blindness and hence gender bias that prevails in most budgetary analysis is to be overcome. Now, Professor Elson is not only noticeable for her rigorous interdisciplinarity, but I would stress her rigorous interdisciplinarity. She currently holds a chair in sociology, but was previously professor of economics. So she's actually had two different chairs in two quite different academic disciplines. So she's not only rigorously interdisciplinary, but also, in my view, remarkably accessible. Over the decades, her frequent interventions have shaped international development studies, but there are few people that I know who are better able at making complex economic models, economic thinking, and analysis understandable to non-economists. And she's at home talking to women's groups in Uganda or India as she is speaking to groups of world-class economists in Washington or international policymakers in New York. Now this is because, I think, in part, because of a characteristic that only those who have met her, as I've been fortunate to do, can witness. The inclusiveness of her approach to economics, to policymaking, and to advocacy. She's someone who, no matter who you are or where you're coming from, she'll closely listen to what you have to say, find a unique or interesting point that you're making, and then show how that point alters when a gender perspective is applied to it. In so doing, not only does the listener feel that they're being taken seriously, but also the listener is far more likely to change their way of thinking. This is why, for myself as well as for generations of international development students, Professor Elson's work has been little short of a revelation. Here was someone talking about the real world in a way which we could understand, in a way which changed the way we thought about it and thought about the place of us in that world. And she does this for a very simple reason. She wants the world to change. She thinks a more socially equitable and humane form of development is possible if people are empowered. Now, when I came to Trent University, I did so in part because it offers the kind of undergraduate program in international development studies that takes the scholarship of Diane Elson very seriously in its efforts to produce accomplished and critical activist scholars seeking to challenge dominant orthodoxies and dominant power relations. The students this year taking Professor Solway's second-year class on development theory, Professor Schaefer's third-year class on international development in economic context, or Professor Bayer's third-year class on law rights and development are going to know this because Professor Elson's work is widely used in these courses. This affinity between the work of Professor Elson and the interests and concerns of the students that major in international development at Trent University make it, I believe, especially appropriate that the second annual David Morrison Lecture be delivered by Professor Diane Elson. Today, Professor Elson will speak to us on gender and the global economic crisis. She'll speak for 45 minutes to an hour, after which there will be an opportunity for questions, and after the questions there will indeed be a small reception. But before she speaks, may I take this opportunity to thank you all for coming and to ask you all to welcome Professor Elson.
Well, first let me say how very happy I am to be here, to meet some old friends, to make some new ones. I already know some new ones over there, and I hope at the reception afterwards to get to know some of you who are studying here too. I think Haroon has explained for me why I'm going to find this a good place to come, because of the kind of work that you're doing here in the International Development Studies program. I couldn't think of a place where I'd be more excited to come and meet people. And I also want to thank David Morrison for having this great idea of setting up this annual lecture series, which has brought me here. When I was talking with Haroon about what I might talk about, we thought maybe something to do with the economic crisis and how it's affecting people in developing countries. And I agreed to do that, and because it's a very big topic, so I'm particularly going to home in on an aspect of the crisis which I think, or the crises, which I think
is less visible and may be neglected. You see my subtitle there, Women's Unpaid Work and Invisible Safety Net, question mark. So first the context. When we're talking about developing countries, we're talking about a multi-dimensional crisis. Even before Lehman Brothers went bust about a year ago, just down the road in Wall Street, there was in many developing countries a serious crisis arising from rapid rises in the price of food and fuels. And then on top of that, in the last year, there have been the backwash effects of our financial crisis, slowing down growth and in some cases even leading to falls in output in developing countries. I'll say a little bit about how that backwash effect has happened. One important way has been the fall of remittances. People here in cities in Canada, in cities in the USA, in cities in Europe who had migrated from developing countries have either been losing their jobs or they've been earning less than they were before. And so the remittances they were able to send home have fallen. Our banks have been lending less to developing countries. Big financial institutions have been investing less in the shares of firms in developing countries. Some countries, like Italy for instance, have started to cut back on their foreign aid. I don't think Canada and the UK have done that yet, but we may see more of that happening. And less demand for exports. We have been buying less clothes, less cut flowers, less new electronic goods, all things that are exported from developing countries. The Chinese have been buying less iron ore, less minerals of all kinds. So there's been a fall in the exports from many developing countries. And so that's how, although they didn't have a financial crisis last year, and nevertheless they've been caught up in the effects of our financial crisis. Well, I say our because I'm British. I know you in Canada, again, you were smarter at regulating your banks and you didn't let a financial sector get too big and too dominant. But in the UK, just as in the USA, we did. So the hour is more mine than yours in this respect. But in developing countries, this crisis of economic crisis has come, of course, in the context of ongoing longer-term challenges. Climate change, demographic change, an emerging crisis of care, as in the higher income developing countries, they're undergoing the same kind of demographic changes as we have here in Canada and in Western Europe in terms of the aging of the population, how to care for an older population, coming as well in the context of big challenges in healthcare already in many low-income countries. It is, of course, an uneven crisis. Across countries, locations and social groups, it's having different effects. I was just in New York last week talking to a woman who's a leader from Africa, Winnie Byanyima, who's the head of the gender team in the United Nations Development Programme. She said she'd just come back from Uganda. The president was saying, crisis, what crisis? In Uganda, our growth really hasn't slackened. We're still doing okay. But that's not, of course, true of many countries. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got countries which have seen falls in the absolute level of their national output and their per capita output, just as we've seen in some of the richer countries.